begin, take a slow breath and let the noise of the day fall gently behind you. Tonight, we step into a chapter of history that few people truly understand. A story wrapped in velvet and gold, yet rotting beneath the surface. It is a tale of a king adored in his youth, cursed in his final days, and remembered not for the grandeur of his palace but for the shadows he cast over an entire kingdom. As we move deeper into his world, each detail will unfold like a whisper behind the walls of Versailles, revealing secrets France tried to bury and choices that shaped the path to revolution. Settle in, relax your shoulders, and let this strange, haunting journey guide you into the quieter hours of the night. And if you enjoy stories told softly, mysteries from the past, forgotten tragedies, and hidden truths delivered in a calm voice, you can gently tap the like button and subscribe. Not for me, but so the next time you need a peaceful escape, these stories can find their way back to you. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The Rise of the Well-Beloved. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world seems to drift between memory and dream, the Palace of Versailles rests beneath a velvet sky. Its endless halls of gold and polished mirrors once shimmered with the confidence of absolute rule. Yet by the year 1774, those same mirrors reflected a different truth, one softened by dust, disillusion, and the slow fading of royal glory. In this tranquil retelling, we return to an age when France still breathed under the weight of monarchy, and when a single life, wrapped in silk and ceremony, would mirror the rise and decay of an entire nation. The man history would come to know as Louis XV, Louis the Well-Beloved, entered and exited the world stage in a manner so contradictory that his story feels almost like a dream slipping out of order. Celebrated, adored, and welcomed as a symbol of renewal in his youth, he would leave this life as a monarch whom many had grown to fear, resent, or mistrust. His end was marked not only by illness, but by the symbolic collapse of everything his crown was meant to represent. It is said, in the more dramatic accounts, that the smell of his failing body drove even loyal attendants away. Yet here, in the hush of this telling, it becomes instead a reminder of how power itself can erode long before the mortal shell does. But before that final scene, before the fears, the regrets, and the stifled whispers in the corridors, we must drift backward through time. The true meaning of Louis's downfall can only be understood by returning to the fragile beginning, when he was only a child, barely old enough to grasp the weight of the crown placed upon his head. The year 1715 marked the closing of an era. Louis XIV, the Sun King, whose reign had blazed across Europe for 72 unbroken years, finally yielded to mortality. His death left France with a treasury strained by grand wars and even grander ambitions. Yet his chosen successor was no mighty prince or seasoned diplomat. It was a gentle, wide-eyed child of 5. The future, Louis XV, great-grandson of the Sun King, orphaned early and raised in the shadow of responsibilities far greater than any child could comprehend. During his minority, the kingdom was guided by the regency of Philippe d'Orléans, whose leadership brought a brief breeze of openness and reform. Under this gentler rule, France began to recover from decades of conflict, and the young king received an education as polished and meticulous as any in Europe. His tutors noted a keen mind, a curiosity for languages, science, and the workings of the world, a promise, they believed, of a wise sovereign in the making. When Louis finally came of age and assumed full authority in 1723, France rejoiced. After the stern twilight years of Louis XIV's rule, the people saw in the youthful monarch a new dawn, Handsome, thoughtful, and seemingly benevolent, he was greeted with genuine affection. In those early days, he truly earned the title Le Bien-Aimé, the well-beloved. Streets would echo with blessings spoken softly at his passing carriage, and even the weary believed that France's future would be bright under his gaze. Louis's marriage, too. Marie Leszczyńska, the daughter of the exiled King of Poland, further strengthened his image as a stable and considerate ruler. Their union was warm, almost tender by royal standards, and soon the palace brimmed with children and the comfort of a secure succession. The king supported the flourishing of arts and sciences, inviting thinkers, inventors, and painters to Versailles, nurturing the culture that made France the envy of the world. In these serene early years, the kingdom seemed to drift peacefully, buoyed by the optimism surrounding its young sovereign. Yet even in this pleasant glow, faint shadows had begun to gather, subtle, almost imperceptible, like the first hints of a coming storm. Louis, despite his intelligence, struggled with decisiveness. The burdens of rule exhausted him, and he quietly began leaning on courtiers, confidants, and later his mistresses for counsel. What began as small hesitations grew into habitual dependence, and gradually the elegance of Versailles shifted into something looser, more indulgent, and increasingly whispered about. The court, once a place of dignified ritual, acquired a reputation for excess. Pleasure slowly edged out discipline, and Louis, who longed to escape the responsibilities placed upon his shoulders as a child, allowed himself to slip ever deeper into distractions. At first, few perceived this as dangerous. After all, France remained powerful, beautiful, and rich in culture. But each passing year added another thread to a tapestry of future misfortune. The transformation from beloved sovereign to weary, mistrusted king was not sudden, but slow, like the dimming of a candle that once burned brightly. Military failures, financial mismanagement, and scandals that rippled through the palace corridors gradually eroded the people's confidence. Their hopes for renewal turned into murmurings of disappointment, then into open frustration. The France Louis had inherited as a child was beginning to crack beneath the pressure of political missteps and the monarchy's growing detachment from its people. Yet in this sleep-softened telling, we do not rush toward catastrophe. We allow each moment to settle gently, as history often does when viewed through the quiet lens of night. For before the storms of revolution, before the fear and fury that would later engulf the kingdom, there was simply a boy who had been crowned too early, adored too fiercely, and burdened far beyond what any human heart was shaped to bear. And so begins the story of Louis XV, not with his final breath, nor with the decay of a tarnished legacy, but with the fragile glow of promise that once surrounded him. A promise that, in the soft stillness of this tale, feels almost within reach again, if only for a moment. Chapter 2. War, Scandal, and the Cracks in the Crown. As the tranquil years of Louis XV's early reign drifted further into memory, the serenity that had once surrounded the young king began to thin like morning mist. France, always a nation whose heartbeat echoed far beyond its borders, found itself drawn into a conflict that would test not only its armies, but the very stability of its monarchy. The year 1740 brought with it the tremors of the War of the Austrian Succession, a struggle born from shifting alliances, dynastic claims, and the ambitions of Europe's ever-restless powers. What began as a distant ripple soon swelled into an 8-year storm that would unsettle the quiet promise of Louis's rule. France entered the conflict hoping to check British influence and bolster the rise of Frederick the Great in Prussia. Yet beneath these diplomatic justifications lay deeper uncertainties that reflected the king himself. Unlike the calculated grand campaigns of Louis XIV, whose strategies had once shaped the fate of nations, the new war unfolded with no clear rhythm. Plans shifted, goals blurred, and decisions seemed to drift not from coherent leadership, but from fragmented councils at Versailles, where factions whispered and courtiers maneuvered with delicate intrigues. The armies of France, once feared across Europe, found themselves struggling in battles that should have belonged to them. The cost of these missteps was immense. Taxes rose, loans multiplied, and France sank further into the financial quagmire left behind by earlier reigns. While Louis XV occasionally appeared on the battlefield, an act that thrilled his subjects for a brief moment, the impression of royal bravery could not mask the truth. The kingdom's strategies were muddled and its leadership fragile. Those who served the king soon recognized that his heart was caught between duty and distraction, and his judgment often swayed by personal affections rather than steady governance. It was during this period that the distance between Louis and Queen Marie Leszczyńska deepened. Their marriage, once a gentle partnership, gradually faded into formality. Into that void stepped the woman who would shape the king's life more profoundly than any minister, Madame de Pompadour, born Jeanne-Antoinette Poisson. Intelligent, charming, and gifted with a remarkable political instinct, she became not only Louis's confidant, but the axis upon which much of the royal court began to turn. To some, she was a civilizing force, graceful, cultured, a supporter of the arts and Enlightenment thinkers. To others, she was a symbol of decadence, a reminder that the king's passions now guided affairs of state more than sober counsel. Whispers swirled through Parisian streets and echoed from countryside villages. Pamphlets circulated, lampoons flourished, and a frustrated people began to question whether their monarch cared more for his private pleasures than their well-being. At Versailles, the king's retreat from public life became increasingly noticeable. He spent more time in intimate gatherings and secluded apartments, withdrawing from the grand rituals that had once bound monarch and nation together. The glittering world of the palace began to feel oddly hollow, its brilliance unable to disguise the widening fissures beneath. The war finally sputtered to an uneasy end in 1748 with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, a peace agreement that effectively returned many territories to their original powers. It was as though years of bloodshed had been spent chasing shadows. French families, who had sacrificed sons and livelihoods, looked at the outcome with bitterness. Their sacrifices felt wasted, the objectives unclear, and their king increasingly distant. The cherished title of Le Bien-Aimé, the well-beloved, now carried a note of irony, its warmth fading as public disappointment turned slowly to resentment. Yet the greatest storms were still to come. During the 1750s, France's discontent grew quietly but steadily. Tales, some true, some exaggerated, spread about Louis's lavish spending on favorites, about secret apartments and private entertainments, about decisions shaped behind closed doors. The king's creation of the Petit Trianon, a refined retreat gifted to Madame de Pompadour, became a powerful symbol in the public imagination. It seemed to reveal, more clearly than any decree, where the king's heart and priorities lay. Then in 1756, a new conflict erupted, one that would stretch across continents and seas, casting a long shadow over the French monarchy. The 7 Years' War unfolded not merely as a European struggle, but as the first global conflict of the modern age. France and Britain collided in North America, India, the Caribbean, and across the oceans. The kingdom's armies, depleted by earlier wars and hampered by indecision, faltered again and again. Canada, with its vast forests and thriving settlements, slipped from France's grasp. Even more devastating were the losses in the Mississippi Basin, areas that had once whispered promises of a sprawling French empire. To the French people, these defeats felt like watching the world crumble in slow motion. How had a nation so powerful, so proud, fallen so far? Rumors swept through France that the king was more present at private suppers than in councils of war, that his energies were devoted not to strategy, but to companionship and comfort. Whether fair or not, the perception was enough. Trust in the monarchy, already weakened, was now ruptured, and so the crown, once brilliant and unshakable, began to show its deepest cracks. Between war, scandal, and growing disillusionment, the king who had once embodied hope now seemed remote, unreachable, and strangely weary. France's future grew uncertain, its people restless, its royal court draped in splendor but trembling beneath the weight of its own fragility. But in this quiet telling, this soft, drifting reflection, we pause before judgment. For the story of Louis XV is not merely one of failure, but of a man born into grandeur he never asked for, navigating storms that even the most resolute heart could not fully command. The night deepens, the palace lights dim, and the tale drifts onward, toward the moment when the kingdom's fate will hinge on the final years of a king who once inspired love, and who now unknowingly guides France toward a transformation more profound than any war. Chapter 3. A Kingdom on the Brink. As the years drifted onward, the glow that had once surrounded Louis XV dimmed like a candle burning too low to warm a room. The kingdom he inherited, vibrant, proud, and overflowing with possibility, now felt weary under the weight of constant conflict. War, once the instrument through which French kings shaped empires, had become a slow, relentless drain, pulling France ever closer to financial ruin. With each campaign and each defeat, the treasury thinned, and the burden of recovery fell almost entirely upon those least able to bear it. Taxes grew heavier, introduced with increasing frequency, and collected with the cold insistence of survival. Yet the nobles and clergy, sheltered by ancient privileges, remained untouched by these new levies. The sight of hard-working families surrendering more and more of their meager earnings, while the privileged elite offered nothing in return, stirred resentment like a pot left simmering too long. France's inequitable tax structure, so long tolerated, now became a spark in the growing tinder of public anger. Louis XV saw the crisis but could not summon the resolve to confront it. Ministers proposed reforms, whispered courageous plans, and warned that disaster would follow inaction. But the king hesitated, or retreated, or allowed powerful factions to override the voices urging change. His reluctance to challenge entrenched interests ensured that the kingdom's fiscal wounds deepened rather than healed. By the time the 7 Years' War concluded in 1763, France was not only exhausted, it was fundamentally shaken. The Treaty of Paris, bleak and unforgiving, stripped France of its vast colonial dreams. Canada was lost, once promising territories surrendered, and the nation found itself humbled on the world stage. The king who had entered his reign as a symbol of hope now stood as the embodiment of failure, though perhaps no man could have withstood the pressures he faced. Yet in the eyes of his people, the transformation was complete. Louis le Bien-Aimé, the well-beloved, had become a monarch few admired and many despised. In the years that followed, Louis XV withdrew even further from the responsibilities of rule. As the kingdom staggered under the weight of debt, hunger, and frustration, the king's world shrank into a carefully maintained bubble within the ornate walls of Versailles. There, surrounded by polished marble, manicured gardens, and shimmering chandeliers, he followed a daily routine, that felt increasingly disconnected from the struggles of his subjects. He hunted in the forests surrounding the palace, immersed himself in rituals of court life, and spent long evenings in private apartments reserved for his most intimate companions. The presence of powerful mistresses intensified public anger. Madame de Pompadour, who had long guided the king's decisions with intelligence and subtlety, continued to wield extraordinary influence. After her death, the role passed to Madame du Barry, whose elevation from common birth to the highest circles of power became a subject of endless gossip. Appointments, policies, even diplomatic alliances seemed shaped as much by these personal relationships as by the needs of the nation. To many, this was proof that the monarchy had strayed into moral decay, a court more concerned with pleasure and patronage than governance. Religious tensions added another layer of discord. The king's support for the expulsion of the Jesuits in 1764 won favor among certain groups, but deeply alienated traditional Catholics who saw the move as an attack on a respected order. Combined with Louis XV's personal life, so often whispered about in churches and salons alike, the fracture between the monarchy and its most devout supporters widened. A king who once embodied paternal care was now viewed with suspicion, even by those who had defended him for years. Meanwhile, France's economic frustrations continued to build. Ministers like Étienne de Silhouette and Jean-Baptiste de Machaut d'Arnouville attempted bold reforms, but each effort was met with resistance from those who benefited from the old system. Outdated rules smothered innovation, and powerful families clung tightly to privileges that stifled the country's ability to grow. Through it all, the king's apparent indifference to these struggles only deepened the discontent. Merchants, lawyers, and educated commoners, the burgeoning middle class, began to question whether France might need more than gentle reforms. Perhaps it required a reshaping altogether. Unrest spread quietly, then loudly. Food shortages led to riots in villages and cities alike, where desperate families pleaded for bread while soldiers were dispatched to maintain order. The government's iron-fisted responses hardened hearts. Many began to believe that the king no longer saw them, no longer heard them, no longer cared. The spirit of the Enlightenment, which had once floated gently through salons and coffee houses, now swelled like a rising tide. Philosophers such as Voltaire, Diderot, and Rousseau challenged the foundations of absolute monarchy, asking questions that could not be unasked. They wrote of liberty, justice, and the rights of man, ideas that seeped into the thoughts of artisans, clerks, students, and soldiers. And as Louis XV's personal shortcomings became more visible, these philosophical critiques found fertile soil. Every scandal, every failure, every injustice seemed to confirm the Enlightenment's warnings about unchecked royal power. The attempted assassination of Louis XV in 1757 by Robert-François d'Amiens shocked the kingdom, though the king survived with only a superficial wound. Yet the aftermath revealed a troubling truth. The attack did not provoke the overwhelming sympathy a wounded sovereign might have expected. Instead, many quietly wondered what pushed a man to such desperation. Even Damiens himself, tortured and interrogated, spoke of a king who had lost the love of his people. The incident exposed just how fragile the monarchy had become. International affairs offered little relief. France watched helplessly as Poland, long considered a friendly nation, was carved up by neighboring powers in the first partition of Poland. The king's inability to respond convincingly to this geopolitical crisis further damaged the crown's already fading prestige. It seemed France, once the mighty heart of Europe, was now drifting, unsure of its place, and unable to steady itself. And yet within the soft glow of this sleep story, We do not rush to anger or judgment. Instead, we drift through the corridors of Versailles with quiet steps, sensing the exhaustion of a man born into unimaginable duty. We see a king overwhelmed by a changing world, caught between old expectations and new realities, struggling against currents stronger than he could navigate. Louis XV's reign, once radiant with promise, now teetered on the edge of collapse. But the final act of this long and troubled story still lay ahead, an ending written not only by kings and ministers, but by an entire nation ready to redefine its destiny. As the years slipped quietly into the late 1760s, France found itself drifting into an uneasy twilight. The world beyond its borders saw a kingdom uncertain of its own strength, and many European courts whispered about the fading power of a once mighty nation. Every diplomatic stumble, each treaty France failed to shape, each alliance it struggled to maintain, seemed to echo the same sentiment. Louis XV no longer commanded the respect his predecessors once enjoyed. At home, these embarrassments deepened the growing sense that the king was no longer the steady hand France needed. By this time, the divide between the crown and its people had become a vast and troubled gulf. Louis XV ruled a nation that increasingly doubted not only his judgment, but his willingness to care for those beneath his throne. The problems that would one day erupt into revolution were already seeded across France: economic despair, political stagnation, social frustration. Yet the king moved through these tensions as though wrapped in a veil, unable, or perhaps unwilling, to confront the storm forming around him. The dawn of the 1770s brought little relief. France's finances had collapsed into a state few monarchs before him had ever dared to allow. Debt hung over the country like a storm cloud that refused to drift away. One finance minister after another stepped forward, each convinced that they alone possessed the solution. Reforms were proposed, debated, resisted, and finally abandoned. Nothing took root. Every attempt at change met fierce opposition from those who benefited from the existing order, and Louis XV's support for meaningful reform weakened the moment these powerful groups pushed back. The crown needed courage, but received hesitation. Meanwhile, hardship crept across the land. Failed harvests left families hungry, markets unstable, and cities bursting with unrest. Bread riots became a familiar sight as desperation pushed people to the brink. Taxes, already crushing, fell most heavily upon those who could least afford them, while the privileged paid little and lived comfortably, untouched. The contrast between the splendor of Versailles and the struggle of ordinary citizens sharpened with each passing season. Rumors spread of lavish feasts, extravagant jewelry, and whispered indulgences. Even when exaggerated, the stories carried enough truth to deepen resentment. Amid this already charged atmosphere, the presence of Madame du Barry brought fresh scandal. Unlike earlier mistresses who at least navigated court life with practiced elegance, du Barry was openly resented for her humble origins and striking influence. Her rise ignited outrage not only among the nobility, who saw her as an affront to tradition, but also among common people who viewed her as a symbol of a monarchy drifting into decadence. To many, she represented everything that had gone wrong within the palace walls: personal pleasure overshadowing national responsibility. Religious tensions added yet another layer of instability. Louis XV's decisions regarding the suppression of certain religious orders, combined with his ongoing disputes with the Parlement of Paris, alienated some of his strongest traditional supporters. The struggle between the king and the Parlements evolved into a constitutional crisis, one that Louis ultimately met not with compromise, but with exile and replacement. His choice to silence one of France's oldest judicial bodies did not restore order. Instead, it fueled suspicions that the monarchy had grown authoritarian and out of touch. At the same time, the Enlightenment was weaving its ideas through salons, universities, and cafes. Writers and philosophers questioned the legitimacy of absolute monarchy, argued for rights and representation, and openly critiqued the failures of rulers who wielded unchecked power. Their words resonated more deeply with each new misstep of Louis XV's government. It seemed as though the king himself had become the very example that Enlightenment thinkers warned about. A ruler who had lost both moral authority and the confidence of his people. Beyond France's borders, the nation's diplomatic reputation eroded steadily. Often its foreign policy appeared governed by the shifting alliances and jealousies of the royal court rather than strategic national interests. France stumbled from one diplomatic embarrassment to another, and rivals quietly took advantage. The echo of lost opportunities lingered throughout Europe, a quiet reminder of how far France had fallen from its days of dominance under Louis XIV. As the king entered the final years of his life, his health began to show the wear of age and stress. He still clung to familiar routines, the hunts, the ceremonies, the rituals of court life. But those who observed him closely noticed a dimming spark. His face seemed lined not only by years, but by the weight of criticism, regret, and decisions long deferred. Yet no one could have foreseen how grimly symbolic his death would be, nor how deeply it would shape the final chapter of the Ancien Régime. Across France, satirical pamphlets, bawdy songs, and secret publications circulated despite censorship, mocking the king with unprecedented boldness. They portrayed Louis XV not as a sovereign touched by divinity, but as a weary, flawed man distracted by pleasures while his kingdom unraveled. The man once hailed as Louis the Well-Beloved had become, in the eyes of many, a tragic figure. Too isolated to understand his people, too indecisive to guide them, too indulgent to regain their trust. And so, by the time the decade neared its end, the old foundations of France were shaking. The monarchy had lost its shine. Its people had lost patience. The government teetered on bankruptcy, social tensions simmered dangerously, and the authority of the crown grew thinner with each passing year. The revolution had not yet begun, but everything necessary for its arrival was already in place, waiting only for the moment that would ignite France and bring the old world crashing down. Chapter 4. The king begins to rot. The spring of 1774 drifted into Versailles with its usual softness, but within the polished rooms of the Petit Trianon, an unease had begun to settle. Louis XV had arrived there seeking rest, accompanied by Madame du Barry, whose presence had long stirred gossip across France. At first, the king's discomfort seemed little more than fatigue, headaches, chills, and a heaviness in his limbs that his physicians blamed on his relentless schedule of hunting, ceremonies, and court obligations. For a man of his age, they said, such symptoms were hardly unusual. Yet beneath this calm reassurance, something darker was already at work. Within only a few days, the king's mild discomfort deepened into unmistakable illness. His fever rose sharply, his strength faltered, and an alarming restlessness crept into his sleep. Doctors watched in growing concern as the familiar signs of smallpox appeared on his skin. Tiny red points at first, then swelling, then the dreaded pustules that had terrorized Europe for generations. April 28th marked the moment the truth could no longer be denied. Smallpox had invaded the king's body, and with it came a tide of fear that rippled through the palace corridors. The disease had no regard for wealth or lineage. It had claimed queens, princes, warriors and peasants alike. Versailles, usually a sanctuary of opulence, became the epicenter of dread. Courtiers who just days earlier had crowded around the king now fled with desperate haste, aware that the illness was merciless and fiercely contagious. Those unable to leave fast enough barricaded themselves in distant rooms, praying the infection would not seek them next. Louis XV's doctors, men like Dr. Bordeaux and Dr. Layson, were respected throughout Europe, but in the face of smallpox they were rendered nearly helpless. Medicine of the era had no cure, only rituals of bloodletting, purging, and poultices that did little more than exhaust the patient further. The king's condition worsened with terrifying speed. What had begun as scattered spots soon multiplied into a thick, blistered mask that covered nearly every inch of his once admired face and body. Pain consumed him. His attendants reported hearing him cry out, unable to bear the fire burning beneath his skin. As the pustules swelled and broke, the air in his chambers grew thick with a sickening stench. Even servants who had dedicated their lives to royal service hesitated to remain by his bedside. Some fainted, others refused to enter at all. Physicians braced themselves, forcing their way through the suffocating odor to offer what little aid they could, though each visit felt more futile than the last. The magnificence of Versailles seemed to corrode around him. The hall of mirrors, the grand chambers, the silks and gold, all the symbols of majesty faded in the shadow of disease. The palace had transformed into something resembling a charnel house, its brilliance mocked by the suffering it now contained. The psychological torment of the illness struck nearly as cruelly as the physical. Louis XV, who had always cared deeply about appearances, could no longer face his own reflection. The once celebrated beauty of his youth had vanished, replaced by a swollen, decaying visage that no one dared describe aloud. He ordered the mirrors removed, unable to endure what they showed him. The Sun King's grandson had become a figure of horror, eaten alive by a plague that ignored the divine right of kings. Court life, once governed by layers of careful etiquette, collapsed in disarray. Rituals were abandoned, formalities forgotten. Those who might have attended to him escaped the palace entirely. Even those bound by duty kept as much distance as possible. Servants who had followed generations of monarchs now deserted their posts, fearing for their own lives. Madame du Barry, the king's final mistress and the woman who had lived so close to the center of royal power, was forced out of Versailles by the royal family. They feared the scandal her presence could cause, and the accusation that she had contributed to the king's exposure. Her absence left the king profoundly alone. The woman who had shared his laughter and his secrets was now miles away, unable to help him, powerless to defend the man who had raised her from obscurity into glittering influence. Louis XV's final days drifted between clarity and delirium. In his rare lucid moments, he asked for spiritual comfort and expressed quiet remorse, speaking of misjudgments, of failures, of duties he had not fulfilled. He sought forgiveness from a God he had so often ignored and from a people he had never fully understood. Yet these flickers of regret were swallowed by long stretches of torment, fever-driven nightmares, and groans from a body rapidly surrendering to decay. Those who saw him in his last hours never forgot the sight. The king's skin, ruptured and blackening, clung to him like a decaying shroud. His breathing grew ragged, his body convulsed with violent spasms. When death finally came, on May 10, 1774, it was described as both a mercy and a horror. The man born into splendor, raised to embody divine power, died in a manner more gruesome than many prisoners or beggars. His final breath carried no dignity, only suffering. The reaction at Versailles revealed how far the monarchy had fallen from the hearts of the people. Instead of collective mourning or solemn grief, a strange relief filled the air. The courtiers who had once praised him now avoided even speaking his name. His death did not summon reverence. It exposed the emptiness that had grown around the throne. The era of Louis XV ended not with respect, but with the unmistakable sense that France had already begun to drift toward a new and dangerous future. Chapter 5. The Funeral. No one wanted. Across France, the news of Louis XV's death moved not like a wave of sorrow, but like a sudden gust that cleared a stifling room. Instead of prayer and lamentation, there was a strange, unrestrained sense of release. In the streets of Paris, people whispered the news with a kind of stunned satisfaction. Some even allowed themselves to cheer openly, while church bells, normally compelled to toll in mourning, remained silent, as if the towers themselves refused to pretend grief they did not feel. The king who had once been called Le Bien-Aimé, the well-beloved, had departed this world unloved and barely acknowledged. Yet behind the walls of Versailles, another more practical crisis had taken shape. The monarch's body, ravaged by smallpox, deteriorated so quickly that it defied the skills of the royal embalmers. The pustules that had disfigured him in life continued their destruction even after death, and the smell that seeped from the royal chambers grew so overwhelming that servants covered their faces with cloths and still struggled to endure more than a few moments inside. Even those long accustomed to the unglamorous tasks of royal service recoiled in horror. Traditional funerary procedures, ritual washing, perfuming, preparation for lying in state, became almost impossible. The embalmers, who would normally work meticulously for hours, could tolerate only brief attempts before retreating to hallways to steady themselves. Faced with a body already collapsing under the weight of its infection, the staff made the decision to seal the king within a thick lead coffin as quickly as possible. Officially, this haste was justified as a matter of public health. Unofficially, everyone knew it was also an attempt to hide the humiliating consequences of his final illness. The funeral that followed was unlike any France had seen for a reigning monarch. Louis XV, who had sat upon the throne for nearly 6 decades, received no grand procession, no glittering line of nobles, no solemn chant echoing through the galleries of Versailles. Instead, a small, reluctant escort prepared to move the heavy-sealed coffin to the royal necropolis at Saint-Denis. Many courtiers invented reasons not to attend. Others simply slipped away from the palace altogether. Along the route, onlookers gathered not in reverence, but in curiosity, as though watching the disposal of something dangerous rather than paying respects to a sovereign. The lead coffin, sealed so quickly and so tightly, could not fully contain the odor of decay. Even at Saint-Denis, the priests and attendants fought nausea as they attempted to perform the burial rites. Several became visibly ill. The bishop, who should have spoken lengthy prayers over the resting king, shortened the liturgy to the barest essentials. What should have been a moment of majestic ceremony became a hurried, uncomfortable ordeal, one that left an indelible impression on everyone present. A monarch's burial had become an event marked by the desire to finish quickly and be done with it. Observers across France soon realized the symbolic power of what had happened. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Where Louis XIV had been honored with one of the most magnificent state funerals in European history, Louis XV was carried away with the efficiency of a body that posed a threat. Pamphlets appeared almost immediately, mocking the late king and contrasting his rotting corpse with the radiant image his predecessors had cultivated. Satirical songs circulated in cafes and salons, each one harsher than the last. His physical decay became a metaphor for a monarchy many believed was itself decayed, corrupt, and hollow. And then, overshadowing the uncomfortable burial, came the quiet accession of his grandson. At barely 20 years old, Louis XVI stepped into a role heavy with expectation, and into a realm suffocating under debt, discontent, and distrust. The whispers surrounding his grandfather's ignoble end seemed to follow him like a warning. Even before he donned the crown, France was demanding answers, renewal, and a sense of hope. The old king had long since failed to provide. Louis XV's death was more than the end of a reign. It was a final, unmistakable sign that the old order was reaching its limits. As the soil of Saint-Denis closed over the sealed lead coffin, France did not mourn. Instead, it looked toward the young king with a hunger for change and an undercurrent of impatience. The majesty of monarchy still stood, but the foundation beneath it was beginning to crumble, just as surely as the body that now lay underground. Chapter 6. A Kingdom Collapsing in His Shadow. In the quiet days that followed the death of Louis XV, Europe watched France with a mixture of obligatory politeness and private relief. Courtiers across the continent issued the expected condolences, yet behind embroidered curtains and whispered gatherings, many admitted what they truly felt. France had lost a ruler whose indecision and mismanagement had long weakened the country. The strange and unsettling details of his final illness traveled almost as quickly as the official announcements, turning royal gossip into a form of international commentary. The monarchy that had once dazzled Europe with its grandeur now seemed pitiable, its former brilliance fading into something closer to mockery. The passing of Louis XV marked more than the end of a single reign. It symbolized the collapse of the illusion that French monarchy still possessed divine strength or unshakable authority. His disfiguring illness, so ordinary and so cruel, stripped away any lingering belief that kings were set apart from the frailties of common life. Once, France had been the standard-bearer of absolutism. Now, its sovereign died as any other person might, undone by disease, not destiny. His death revealed not the majesty of royalty, but the vulnerability of a system that had long hidden its rotting foundations beneath ceremony and ritual. What Louis XV left behind was more dangerous than his lifeless body. It was the debt that clung to France like a tightening noose. Years of reckless spending, failed financial reforms, and misguided wars had driven the nation into a crisis so deep that even immediate sweeping changes could barely promise survival. Yet the very elites who blocked every attempt at reform under Louis V stood ready to resist his successor with the same stubborn entitlement. Louis XVI, earnest and inexperienced, inherited not just a throne, but a financial catastrophe that threatened to pull the entire kingdom into ruin, and debts were only the beginning. The simmering frustrations of the French people, resentments that had built slowly and painfully through decades, did not vanish with the old king. Heavy taxes crushed the poor while the nobility and clergy enjoyed exemptions. The cost of living soared while wages stagnated. Entire communities survived on the smallest margins, watching luxury and privilege flourish, untouched behind palace gates. Louis XVI wished to help his people, but goodwill alone could not untangle the resentment embedded so deeply into the social fabric. When improvements failed to appear, the blame gradually shifted from the man who had died to the institution he had represented. Beyond France's borders, the consequences of Louis XV's failures continued to unfold. The nation's once sprawling colonial empire had shrunk dramatically. French diplomats, once feared or respected across Europe, struggled now to maintain influence. The king's grandson would attempt to restore France's prestige by supporting the American Revolution, but victory abroad only worsened the crisis at home. Money slipped away faster than glory returned. The decline that began under Louis XV had gained too much momentum, and no war, whether won or lost, could reverse it. Meanwhile, the intellectual climate of the country had transformed. Philosophers of the Enlightenment had spent decades questioning the foundation of absolute monarchy, and their ideas had now taken root far beyond the salons of Paris. Ordinary citizens, merchants, lawyers, students, people who once simply accepted royal authority, began to imagine a world where power belonged not to birth, but to reason. The monarchy's moral authority, already shaken, was now hollow. Changing the king could not change the system. The ideas that would one day ignite revolution were already smoldering. Louis XVI found himself trapped in the same web of contradictions that had ensnared his grandfather. Royal power was still expected to be absolute, yet every attempt at reform was blocked by those who benefited from the old order. Taxation was desperately needed, but those with wealth refused to contribute. The machinery of government groaned with inefficiency, its ancient privileges and competing jurisdictions preventing even the simplest modernization. Where once these traditions had built France into Europe's strongest kingdom, they now stood as immovable barriers, preventing survival. The shadow of Louis XV's death stretched far beyond his burial. The grotesque details of his final days, the smell, the secrecy, the desperate attempts to hide his decaying body, became metaphors whispered throughout France. Revolutionaries would later use these images with ruthless effectiveness, arguing that a monarchy capable of such decay was one that deserved to fall. The king's suffering became a symbol of systemic rot, a reminder that no institution, however revered, could avoid the consequences of its own failures. Even the public reaction to his passing carried significance. The open celebrations, the lack of grief, the boldness with which people mocked the once sacred crown, all of it revealed a profound shift in the relationship between ruler and ruled. The monarchy had always relied on a sense of reverence, a belief that the king was not merely a man but the heart of France. Yet here, in the streets of Paris, that illusion crumbled. People rejoiced without fear. Criticism no longer whispered in secrecy, but spoken freely. When the day of reckoning finally arrived, this unraveling of loyalty made it tragically easy for revolutionary voices to rally the public against Louis XVI. Even the clinical aspects of Louis XV's death played a part in this unraveling. Doctors documented every stage of his illness, and these accounts circulated widely. They revealed a truth that absolutism had long attempted to hide. Kings were human, subject to the same decay, the same pain, the same laws of nature as anyone else. The notion that a monarch's body was somehow sacred or exceptional evaporated. Disease did not discriminate. This stark reminder of human equality became a quiet but powerful blow to the ideology that had sustained monarchy for centuries. Louis XV's journey, from adored child king to detested ruler, became a lesson studied across Europe. His reign demonstrated how fragile authority becomes when leaders ignore the needs of their people. It showed that power built on ritual, rather than trust, cannot survive true crisis. And it revealed that the downfall of a monarchy is rarely sudden. It is a slow accumulation of failures, avoided responsibilities, and voices left unheard. In the end, his legacy was not a line of triumphs or a kingdom made stronger. It was a warning, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority, the cost of ignoring suffering, and the inevitable collapse that follows when leaders drift too far from the people they claim to guide. As the old regime edged toward its final days, the shadow of Louis XV lingered, a reminder that even the grandest institutions can fall, and often begin to crumble long before anyone notices the cracks. The final days of Louis XV were so grotesque, so steeped in decay and isolation, that they seemed almost scripted by fate itself, an ending perfectly matched to a reign that had been quietly rotting long before disease took hold of the king's flesh. As the smallpox advanced, consuming his body inch by inch, the people outside the palace gates were not mourning but rejoicing. The monarch once praised as the well-beloved had lived long enough to witness the complete reversal of his reputation, and his death unfolded as a chilling mirror of the kingdom he left behind, weakened, abandoned, and collapsing from within. His sick room, thick with the overpowering smell of infection, drove courtiers away in disgust. Servants worked in shifts, unable to tolerate more than a few minutes near the dying king. It was not simply the physical stench that unsettled those who remained, it was the unmistakable symbolism. Louis XV's body, ravaged by disease, reflected the political and moral decomposition of the French monarchy itself. As his skin blistered and his strength failed, the institution that had once commanded Europe's awe seemed to wither with him. The isolation of the king became the isolation of the crown. The foul air surrounding his bed felt like the breath of a dying era. The tragedy of Louis XV lies not only in his end, but in the heartbreaking distance between what he was expected to be and what he ultimately became. When he first ascended the throne, France dared to hope for a ruler who would restore stability and inspire confidence after the long, formidable reign of Louis XIV. Instead, he drifted through decades marked by hesitation, scandal, and missed opportunities. Pleasure won out over principle, convenience over courage, and in the quiet shadows of indecision, France's problems multiplied. The monarch who might have renewed the kingdom instead became the architect of its humiliation, and without intending to, the spark behind the coming revolution. His failures did not stop at the borders of his own realm. Louis XV's missteps reverberated across Europe, altering alliances and disrupting the delicate balance of power. France's shrinking influence opened vast opportunities for Britain, whose expanding colonial empire reshaped global politics for generations. As France stumbled, rival nations grew bolder, sensing opportunity in the kingdom's weakness. The repercussions would be felt long after Louis XV had been laid in the ground. His reign revealed with brutal clarity the fatal flaw of absolute monarchy: immense power without meaningful accountability. Under Louis XIV, that same system had propelled France to unprecedented strength. Under Louis XV, it corroded from within. Without mechanisms to correct mistakes, without leaders willing to confront entrenched privilege, the monarchy proved incapable of adapting to a world that was changing faster than any royal decree could control. A system that refuses to evolve eventually collapses under the weight of problems it refuses to face. When Louis XV died, unattended by most of the court, disliked by his people, and sealed away in a lead coffin to contain the smell, his memory instantly became a weapon. Revolutionaries would later seize upon the details of his death with ruthless effectiveness. Pamphlets and illustrations portrayed the monarch's decaying body as the perfect metaphor for a kingdom that had allowed corruption to fester unchecked. The crown that once claimed divine sanction now appeared diseased and mortal, its authority no more sacred than the flesh that had dissolved beneath the king's final fever. His death became part of the narrative that justified dismantling the old order entirely. And yet, even stripped of romanticism, Louis XV's story offers enduring lessons. It warns of the peril that arises when governments stop listening to their citizens, when leaders place comfort above responsibility, and when institutions cling to tradition instead of truth. It reminds us that legitimacy, the trust of the governed, is more vital than ceremony, titles, or ancient claims to power. A ruler who loses the confidence of his people has already surrendered the foundation of authority, long before the throne itself is threatened. In the end, Louis XV did not leave behind renewal or glory. Instead, he left a kingdom teetering on the edge of transformation. His neglected duties, his failure to confront the crises growing beneath the surface of French society, and the symbolic horror of his final days all combined to push France toward a reckoning it could no longer avoid. His corpse, sealed tightly and hurried into the earth, marked not merely the death of a king, but the beginning of the end for absolute monarchy in France. The revolution that would topple his grandson, dismantle centuries of royal rule, and reshape the course of European history was already whispering in the cobblestones of Paris by the time Louis XV drew his last breath. In many ways, that revolution was the unavoidable consequence of his reign, the final answer to decades of decay he had allowed to spread unchecked. A king once beloved, dying alone and despised, became the perfect symbol of a world preparing to burn and be reborn. Final thoughts. As we reach the end of this quiet descent through the life of Louis XV, what lingers is not simply the rise and fall of a king, but the fragile nature of power itself. His story shows how a kingdom can adore a ruler in one generation and condemn him in the next, how a life lived behind gilded doors can drift slowly, almost silently, toward tragedy. Beneath the glitter of Versailles lay fear, denial, and a nation slowly losing faith in the crown meant to protect it. And as the final chapters of his life unfolded, marked by illness, abandonment, and public scorn, France seemed to turn a page of its own, stepping closer to the edge of transformation. The legacy he left behind was not one of triumph, but a warning that even the most powerful figures are still human, still flawed, and still bound to the consequences of their choices. His story is a quiet reminder that history is shaped as much by inaction as by action, and that the seeds of revolution often begin in moments the world overlooks. If this journey through fading crowns and forgotten corridors helped you unwind or drift a little deeper into rest, I invite you to return whenever the night feels heavy. There will always be more stories, soft, strange, and full of quiet revelations, waiting here for you. And if you'd like these midnight explorations to reach you effortlessly, feel free to tap the like button and subscribe before you close your eyes. No pressure, no urgency, just a gentle way to make sure the next story finds you when you need it most. For now, breathe slowly, let your thoughts settle, and allow sleep to take you the rest of the way. Good night.